actually a thing on which most life depends here on the planet Earth. Photosynthesis. 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 With plants.
Chlorophyll cells taking carbon dioxide, now that's the air that we breathe out.
Combines it with water and exposes it to sunlight, and that's how plants can make their own food. Photosynthesis is why plants need light, and photosynthesis is why humans need plants.
Because through photosynthesis, plants make oxygen and humans need oxygen to breathe.
Photosynthesis. 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 The sun is a miasma of incandescent plasma. The sun's not simply made out of gas. No, no, no. The sun is a quagmire. It's not made of fire. Forget what you've been told in the past. Plasma. Electrons are free. Plasma. A fourth state of matter, not gas. Not liquid, not solid. The sun is no red dwarf. I hope it never morphs into some supernova collapse. The sun is a miasma of incandescent plasma. I forget what I was told by myself. Plasma. Electrons are free. Plasma. A fourth state of matter, not gas. Not liquid, not solid. Plasma. Forget that song. Plasma. They got it wrong. That thesis has been rendered invalid. Iron is a metal, you see it every day. Oxygen eventually will make it rust away. Carbon in its ordinary form is coal. Crush it together and diamonds are born. Come on and meet the elements. May I introduce you to our friends, the elements? Like a box of paints that are mixed to make every shade. They either combine to make a chemical compound or stand alone as they are. Neon's a gas that lights up the sign for a pizza place. The coins that you pay with are copper, nickel, and zinc. Silicon and oxygen make concrete, bricks, and glass. Now add some gold and silver for some pizza place class. Come on and meet the elements. I think you should check out the ones that call the elements. Like a box of paints that are mixed to.
Hello. Oh, there we are. Good evening. Welcome to the Longmont Museum. My name is Justin Veach. I'm the manager of the museum's Stewart Auditorium, and I curate public programs. Thanks for coming out this evening. Wow, we're really having some mic stuff. Let's see if we can iron this out as I continue to welcome you. We don't want, okay, sounding better. Okay, before we get going, I want to thank some folks who make our programming possible. The Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, the Stewart Family Foundation, the Friends of the Longmont Museum, and of course our museum members. Do we have any members with us this evening? Hey members, thank you. We simply can't do all that we do without you. If you're interested in finding out what it means to be a member of the Longmont Museum, feel free to grab me or any of our staff after the program and we'll talk your ear off. We'll tell you everything there ever was to know about membership here at the Longmont Museum. I'd also like to thank our media sponsors, the mighty KGNU Community Radio out of Boulder, KUNC, and the Colorado Sound. If you hadn't noticed, we're doing a little, we're digging around in the parking lot out there. We're actually expanding the museum. We're building a 4,000 square foot gallery space, so that'll bring our total gallery count up to 3. We'll have a dedicated kids space, dedicated history space, and a dedicated rotating gallery space for traveling shows and in-house curated exhibitions. Also, an expanded lobby and new front entrance. We're, the largest museum in Boulder County is about to get significantly larger, but don't tell anybody. Yeah. Oh, okay, tell everyone. We are live streaming this evening. We live stream all of our free talks, or most of our free talks, via Longmont Public Media on our Facebook page, longmontpublicmedia.org. And occasionally our stuff shows up on channel 880 on your Comcast cable dial. Tonight's program is being offered as part of our Thursday Nights at the Museum series. Every Thursday evening we offer a little something, a talk, panel, lecture, film, performance, a little bit of everything. In fact, sometimes I like to call it a potpourri of cultural delight, and I feel like that one's getting kind of old now. I'm going to retire that. Some upcoming programming you might want to be aware of. Tomorrow we have a Friday afternoon concert with Mariachi Las Dalias, and then next week we're showing a film, The Manchurian Candidate, which seems oddly timely to me. And then we have a performance of War of the Worlds on Thursday the 22nd, the original radio play, also rather timely, strangely enough. All kinds of stuff coming up, and if you just grab one of our newsletters on your way out the door, it'll tell you everything about what's happening. This evening's program in particular is a partnership between the Longmont Museum and NSF NCAR. I believe we've been doing this for at least 5 years now, maybe 6, and it's been a terrific partnership. This evening, we have Dr. Kelley Barsanti with us. She received her PhD in Environmental Science and Engineering from the OGI School of Science and Engineering. She then served as Advanced Study Program Postdoctoral Fellow at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Dr. Barsanti's research focuses on the development of mechanistic models for the prediction of atmospheric particulate matter, or aerosols. Her primary research tools include comprehensive two-dimensional gas chromatography and process-level models to elucidate chemical and physical transformations of organic compounds as they evolve from gaseous emissions to particulate constituents. Did you get that? I'm not going to repeat it. Current research projects include improving speciation of organic compounds and emissions inventories for biomass burning and other combustion sources, improving model representation of secondary organic aerosol and biomass burning plumes, and developing models of new particle formation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Kelley Barsanti to the Longmont Museum.
Good evening. Wow, I can't see you at all. I'm going to bring up my presentation also on my phone just in case I get nervous and forget what I'm supposed to be talking about. But I felt like this could be a before and after quiz of how much of my bio you understood at the beginning, and then how much of my bio you'll understand at the end. You'll know more. Okay, so the title of my presentation tonight is What Clear Skies Can Teach Us, A History of Urban Air Quality. And I am going to walk through these different parts of my talk. So I'm going to start with a historical perspective on air quality in the LA Basin. And then I'm going to get into some technical details. We'll talk about definitions associated with air quality. We'll get into some details of health effects and why these air pollutants cause these health effects. We'll talk a little bit about the Clean Air Act. And then I want to dig in just a bit to some research that I led in Los Angeles during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we're just going to wrap up with a little bit of where we are now.
Could you move your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Yes, be happy to do that. You're welcome, no problem. Better? Okay, thanks. So all of the work that I'm talking about today would simply not have been possible with federal funding from agencies such as NSF, the National Science Foundation, NOAA, the Climate Program Office, and EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, so here is a picture of downtown Los Angeles in the this is I think 1948, the LA Civic Center. And this brownish smog really limited visibility at that time to about a block. And the smog was really different than smog in other pollution areas. We might be aware of the Denora or London, the famous London fog. And that was that black, sooty smoke. The smoke in LA was really different. It was a brownish smog. And for a long time, it was thought that this smog, this brownish smog, was coming from a rubber plant. The rubber plant closed after the war, and this pollution didn't go away. So in 1947, there was actually the first air pollution control district established to help figure out what was happening in the LA Basin. Okay, so there were two people that were, we're getting into the scientific discoveries. There were two people that were really instrumental in helping figure out what was happening in Los Angeles. So some of the things that people were observing, besides just not being able to see, is, burning watery eyes. And tire rubber was actually degrading very quickly. Plastic lawn furniture was degrading. And Hagenschmidt, he's the one pictured in both of these photos in his lab in Caltech, suspected that this was due, in fact, to ozone. And he also thought, which was a really unique discovery, that it wasn't ozone that was being released from something, but actually was ozone that was being formed in the air. And then Wendt, who I don't have a picture, actually was demonstrating the damage that ozone was damaging crops. So was also starting to look not only that there was this ozone, but its effects on crops. Okay, so I want to talk about how science and engineering and policy kind of work together. So Hagenschmidt actually took a 1-year leave of absence, and he discovered, in fact, what was leading to this ozone. So what he discovered, that there were these hydrocarbon byproducts of gasoline combustion, okay? So when we combust gasoline in a vehicle engine or other types of combustion processes, that it was contributing these hydrocarbons. They react with nitrogen oxides in the atmosphere, and they were forming ozone. The same process can also lead, or a similar process can also lead to the formation of atmospheric particulate matter, and those are the two air pollutants that I'm going to be talking about most tonight, ozone and particulate matter. So basically, moving forward with trying to improve the air quality in LA, the Motor Vehicle Control Board that was established early on actually became the California Air Resources Board, and the first chair was Hagenschmidt. And CARB was very instrumental in developing the regulations that were eventually adopted by EPA. So I'm going to show you this figure here. There's a lot going on, but what we have is these are years, right? So from 1960 to 2010, we have ozone on the left axis and PM 2.5 on the right. And we typically measure ozone in a 1 hour max, or we average over 8 hours. And so what we see in the red is this maximum 1 hour average in red and the maximum 8 hour average in blue. So this dashed line represents the current air quality standard. And what I just want to say is from like a practical perspective, when you're experiencing ozone around 50 ppb, 60 ppb, right above that standard, you can feel it. You can smell it, you can feel it. So it's really hard to imagine these ambient levels, 400, average 600 ppb of ozone. It's just, these are extreme levels. PM 2.5 similarly was quite high. 80s comes down to around 40, but is above the standard, if you'll notice. But what I want to point out here is that it really was this process of the scientific discovery, right, figuring out what was actually in the smog, where was it actually coming from, a regulatory board getting together and saying, okay, what can we do about this? And some engineering solutions that actually led to cleaner emissions that resulted in this decrease in ozone. This next figure is more complicated, but I wanted to introduce and get back to this idea that this ozone and PM is actually formed in the atmosphere. So it is not directly emitted. Some particulate matter is directly emitted, some is formed. So we also can look at the precursors of ozone, right? So what's the important things that lead to the formation of ozone and how have those changed over time? And again, there's a lot going on here, but really I just want to point out that this is just the concentration, basically, of all of these different compounds. These are different units. But again, you'll just see that there's been sort of this consistent decrease in most of these compounds, and these are all combustion markers. And so again, we've attributed this to basically regulations around cleaner burning gasoline. Okay. So that's a little bit of, what kind of trends we've been experiencing over time. And I want to get a little bit into the Clean Air Act because, again, these trends, that decreasing trend, really was in part driven by the Clean Air Act. So there were some key elements of the Clean Air Act that was passed in 1970, and they were to reduce outdoor ambient air concentrations of key pollutants and reducing emissions of toxic air pollutants as well. And finally, to phase out the production and use of chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer. And one quick thing, we often talk about good ozone and bad ozone. So I've been talking about ozone as bad for your health. That's low ozone, low in the atmosphere ozone. That's what we can contribute to smog and is bad for our health. But there's also stratospheric ozone way up, if you've heard about the ozone hole. And that stratospheric ozone is important for protecting us from the most harmful UV rays. So those were really the three goals of the Clean Air Act. You might have noticed that I have some little notes on the bottom. Some are funny, some are more relevant than others. But basically, one thing I do want to point out here is that the Clean Air Act, in terms of what's regulated, actually hasn't changed since 1970. So we regulate 6 criteria pollutants, and we regulate 189 air toxics at the emission source. And again, these haven't changed since the Clean Air Act was written in 1970. In 1990, there were some amendments to the Clean Air Act. So here you can see George H.W. Bush signing these amendments, and again, linking to California, Mary Nichols, who was the head of CARB, she's the former chair of the California Air Resources Board, actually oversaw the drafting of these amendments. And we think of these 1990 amendments as the teeth behind the Clean Air Act, right, that really allowed transportation policies, inspection maintenance policies and programs, market approaches, incentives, permitting, enforcement, et cetera. So again, the science sort of tells us, points us in the right direction. These enforcement actions allow us to make some progress. Okay, so I want to get to how you probably have seen something on your phone that tells you whether the air is good or bad, right? A green, red, yellow. And I want to talk a little bit where that comes from, and that's why I started with the Clean Air Act. So I mentioned, right, that there were 6 criteria pollutants that were regulated by the EPA, and you don't need to be able to read this chart or this graph, but I just wanted to let you know that you can go and you can actually see the standard levels for these compounds. And so what happens with these criteria pollutants is that the federal government sets a limit. It's a limit for outdoor air concentration, and what it's designed to protect our most sensitive populations. So when the ambient concentrations are below these levels, we say they're protective of the most sensitive individuals. When they're above, we're in exceedance of the standards, and we start seeing health impacts across populations. So those are our national ambient air quality standards. You can find them online. And then basically what happens is that this air quality index, these colored guides that you see, they are referencing what's being measured outside, an outdoor air pollution concentration to the standard. So when we're green, the outdoor concentrations are below the standards, and then higher and higher percentages above the standard lead to these darker and darker colors and hazardous for an increasing number of people or harmful to an increasing number of people. So that's what the air quality index is that you all have probably on your phones. Okay. Okay, so sometimes I think there are some important things to point out when it comes to air quality, and that's why I walk through this historical perspective. So the first thing is that things have gotten a lot better, and I think and again, I think it's an exciting part of what we do as scientists. Being part of that discovery process and then actually seeing it improve people's lives is super exciting. But also I think sometimes we don't realize that still we have this air pollution problem. So one of the things that I like to do is show the impacts of air quality in a global perspective, and then we'll get more and more localized. But I actually sometimes like to do this interactive with a word cloud, but I wasn't sure how that was going to go, because I think if you think about like global risk factors of death, a lot of people wouldn't consider air pollution or think that air pollution was so high, right? But it's like the second global risk factor, right? So that's the total global number of deaths that are associated with various risk factors. So air pollution is high. This is a map showing where those excess deaths and risks are concentrated. So these are, again, deaths that are earlier than would have occurred without these air pollution. So again, we do see this is concentrated in areas with these really high pollutant levels, right? China, India, but I think it's important to point out that about 40% of the US population does live in an area that exceeds one or more of the national ambient air quality standards, right? So we've gotten a lot better, we still have some work to do. Okay, so a little bit about how these air pollutants, specifically PM 2.5 and ozone, affect our bodies. So PM 2.5, I've said particulate matter, aerosols, I won't take it. Okay, so PM 2.5 actually refers to the size of these particles in the atmosphere, and they're very small. So to help put that in perspective, we have fine beach sand that's about 90 microns in size. A human hair is 50 to 70 microns. We talk a little bit sometimes about PM 10. That's also PM that's in the atmosphere, but it's usually things like dust and mold, mites. And then when we go down to PM 2.5, that's what we're talking about mainly in this talk. So they're very small particles. And because of that size, they can uniquely travel deeply into our lungs. So our nose hairs and other parts of our mouth filter out those larger particles, but those small particles really are able to travel deep down into our lungs. And that's one of the reasons why that PM 2.5 has these health effects. Another thing that I think is super interesting about these particles, right, and the size that they also are the right size to interact with incoming solar radiation. So that's how they contribute to some warming and cooling of the atmosphere too. So it's just kind of a unique factor that the size is just the right size to travel deep in our lungs and interact with incoming radiation. So the things that I love about science. Random coincidences. Okay. So this just gives you an idea that, I mean, this PM 2.5 really kind of affects all systems. So there are just a number of studies that link PM 2.5 to respiratory effects and disease, cardiovascular, maternal and infant health, and a number of other impacts. So really this widespread effects on our cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Okay, so I'm gonna play a little video. It repeats some of what was said, but it also helps introduce some new concepts. I think we're doing fine on time, so I might just have the whole thing play. It's a couple minutes. I was only gonna show half, but we might just let it play.
One out of every 8 deaths on planet Earth is due to air pollution. Sometimes it's obvious, but often air pollution is invisible, making it hard to understand and challenging to avoid. In 2012, outdoor air pollution killed 3.2 million people, and indoor air pollution killed 4.3 million. In the US alone, air pollution claims more lives than the opioid crisis and car accidents combined. Your local air quality is a product of 3 things: pollution sources, surroundings, and dilution. In the real-world game of avoiding air pollution, you want to maximize dilution. Dilution defines the extent with which clean air has mixed with the polluted air. Generally speaking, more dilution, less pollution. Not all air is created equal. Air quality can vary dramatically over short distances and rapid timescales. This inherent variability means that even subtle changes in your position or timing can significantly reduce your exposure. This is where you can put your air intuition to use. In our daily routines, sometimes we feel stuck, at the mercy of the pollution sources impacting our air, but you have more control than you think, especially in confined spaces where you can filter dirty air before it gets in. Flexing your air intuition muscle, you can quickly recognize pollution sources, pay attention to the wind, and avoid pollution encounters. It's also important to understand how air pollution impacts indoor environments. Indoors, dilution is generally low, and activities such as cooking and cleaning can result in large spikes in indoor pollution levels. In some areas, outdoor air pollution penetrates into homes due to their proximity to major roadways. Closing up windows at certain times of day and proactively ventilating indoor spaces at other times of day can help create a healthier indoor air environment. Ultimately, teaching others in your community how to use their air intuition can be a force multiplier for good, one breath at a time.
All right, so that video was created by a friend and colleague, and I like it because it introduces a few different things and also restates some of what I've said, but with nice drawings. So one of the things that was mentioned that is a good transition here is sources of air pollutants, right? So you saw there's cars outside, inside, there's things like cooking and cleaning, and so I want to link that back with one of the things that I said earlier, and that is that the ozone and some particulate matter in the atmosphere is formed when gases, these precursors, actually have chemical transformations in the atmosphere. So we have these different sources of these gases that lead to ozone and PM 2.5. And it's really important to understand what those different sources are to come up with mitigation strategies. So again, we have cars, we also have forest fires. It turns out our natural world emits a lot of carbon that can turn into ozone and PM as well, but I want to make an important point that that wouldn't happen without the presence of human pollutants as well. And then we have all of these consumer products also are important sources for air pollutants. Okay. The other part that I'm going to give you I'm just going to ask you, I'm going to count to 3, and then you're going to shout out something that you learned from that slide. So I want to know what else influences pollutants. Eben mentioned 3 things, so I'm going to count to 3 and just shout something out. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, okay, good. So 1 is, again, this chemistry, but you all nailed it with the second one. Oh, where are we? Oh no. Dilution. And another way to say that is mixing, right? So really, when we're looking at how much pollutants there are in the atmosphere, that, the sources matter, chemistry matters, and mixing, meteorology, dilution matters. So when we're trying to figure out what's happening, when we measure, when we go out into the field, it's really complex. It's sort of a complex process, and again, it's more than a complex process. It's a series of many complex processes that you have to try to untangle. Okay, so I'm getting into now to my own research around COVID-19. Just a reminder of the sort of rough timeline in the US, and then specifically in California. In March of 2020, early March, a state of emergency was declared in California. Shortly thereafter, March 19th, shelter-in-place orders were issued in California, and then the Twittersphere erupted. So we were seeing all of these news headlines. The pandemic has led to a huge global drop in air pollution. And then, people just started saying, they're wondering if no traffic plays a part in cleaner air. Duh, man, that's a real head scratcher. Okay, but I will tell you, from the perspective of a scientist, this is, again, one of the things that I just love, is that we don't always know the answers. And in fact, we often don't know the answers. And that's really where we start to pursue this discovery. And so as I was reading through these things, I was thinking to myself, on one hand, it's impossible to imagine that huge reductions in on-road traffic wouldn't lead to huge reductions in combustion pollutants, right? I mean, it just, you can't get your head around it. On the other hand, we had been saying, and we as a scientific community for a few years, that we thought other sources were becoming much more important in urban areas. Remember, I showed you at the beginning those decreasing ozone levels, those decreasing PM 2.5 levels, those decreasing combustion markers, right? I showed you they were coming down because of cleaner burning gasoline. So we've been saying that, cooking and cleaning and other things in the urban atmosphere are more important. So it really led to this minute of what is happening and what is going to be the impact of this huge reduction in human activity? So we were very fortunate. We wrote an NSF, the National Science Foundation, has a program where you can write in and just say, we have to make these measurements right now. We'll never be able to make them again. And we were able to do that safely in COVID by just sending out individual people. So we did that, and I'm going to show you what we found. So, as I mentioned before, chemistry and meteorology are important. I'm going to start with the meteorology. I'm going to walk you through a couple graphs, and I want to just start by showing you what I'm going to show you. So, you're going to see a bunch of lines on this graph, and I just want to point out that this dark green is going to be 2020. You're going to see a light green, and that represents a 5-year average. 2015 to 2019, and then a range, right? Because there's always variability, so we like to look at an average and the range. And then we're also going to be showing temperature. And basically, when you see gray temperature, it means it's consistent with that monthly average, right? Or it wasn't higher or lower. When you see blue, it means it's higher. It means it was colder than the average between 2015 and 2019. And when it's red, it means it was warmer. So I'm going to start with ozone, right? So here we are. The bottom is actually month. I'm sorry, you can't see that right now, the way I structured this. But again, you have this, the dark green is 2020, and we see ozone. So what you can see is that ozone tended to be high, above the average, in periods where the temperature was also above average, right? I want to move to PM 2.5 because if you remember, we can't really see, well, if you think about it, we can't really see ozone, but we can see PM 2.5. And so when again, this erupting twittosphere, the skies were really clear. And so, the question is, was that because there were no cars? Is that the only thing that was happening? And so what we see here is that in March and April, we'll see that the PM 2.5 was actually lower than average, but we also see that it was much cooler than average. And what was happening during this time was actually a lot of rain. So, put some words up here to kind of summarize, but these increases in the 2020 ozone, so first of all, that was a bit strange to see because again, there's no cars, there's a lot of ozone still, and we were associating that with change in temperature, at least partially. On the other hand, we were associating this decrease in PM 2.5 early with rain events, and then I didn't point this out, but if you look later, we have these really high PM 2.5 values, well above monthly averages, and those were associated with fire events. So this just is the beginning to start to see we have these measurements of ambient pollutants, and there's a lot that goes into it, interpretation, right? So we have to think about the meteorology, we have to think about sources like fires, and I'm gonna get a little bit more into other sources next. Okay, so I want to show you what the traffic was doing, so specifically passenger vehicles. So again, these are sort of the pre-COVID levels, right? So everything's normalized, which is 100% pre-COVID levels. And then what you'll see is that down in March, again, around this time that the shelter-in-place orders started, on average, vehicle miles traveled or any kind of measure of passenger vehicles that you could think of showed about a 50% reduction. So about half the vehicles than normal were on the roads. That started to steadily increase between the bottom to about early July. Never quite recovered, but went back to about 80% of the levels. So again, we have this during April and May. We're down, 40 to 50% of the vehicle miles traveled, or passenger vehicle numbers. Again, lots of metrics show the same thing. In June and July, the vehicles were down only by 20, 30%, or returned to 80%, right? So point is, you have this big change between March and April and July, right? So you would expect that we would see something. So the question is, what did we see? All right, so we did two, I should say, I mentioned this earlier, but we did do two campaigns. We did one in 2020, and then we did one in 2022 to see if, our findings were robust, basically. Okay, so this is just a reminder of what was happening with the traffic here. And these are some of our measurements. So we measured carbon monoxide, which is a very standard combustion tracer. And we also measured acetylene, which is also a combustion tracer of traffic. And I just want to first draw your attention to these bars here, which are the mean, and the dots, which are the mean and the average. And what you should see right away is there's not a big difference, right? So this was really surprising to us in some sense. I showed you this, significant return, almost a return to full traffic, but in any case, a big increase in the traffic, and we see almost no change in the median, the average, the mean. Okay, so we were really puzzled by this at first, but we basically came to understand, or we basically decided after we looked at the ratios of lots of different things that we measured, that this was in fact, these combustion markers that we measure in Los Angeles now are coming from more than on-road traffic. And in fact, off-road combustion sources are starting to play a dominant role in what's being measured in LA. So those off-road combustion sources, especially during the pandemic, that we think that we were picking up were largely things like lawnmowers, leaf blowers, perhaps things like motorcycles, off-road vehicles, right? All of these categories. And in fact, if you look at the emissions inventories for the California Air Resources Board, I'm going to walk you through this, but this shows in 2010 versus 2020, the on-road motor vehicle contribution, right? So if you look at 2010, the emission inventory tells us that most of the CO, the CO from on-road vehicles is double that from other. But then when you get into 2020, their emissions inventories were in fact predicting this, right? That you have a much bigger contribution, an equal contribution, if not larger, from other mobile sources. So this is really, this was very surprising to us, but in some ways logical also. And it took a really long time to get this paper published because no one could believe that we didn't see a big change in these combustion markers with that, huge decrease and then increase in traffic. Okay, in that video I showed you from Eben, he mentioned consumer products. So scientists, especially here in Boulder at NOAA, were among the first to start measuring the influence of these products, we call them volatile chemical products, in actually outdoor air as well. So this wall paint, perfumes, and cleaning agents are polluting our air. And so the question is, we saw these two in LA. So this was really an exciting find for us. So I'm talking about this compound here called limonene. It's a lemon-type fragrance, so it's used in a lot of consumer products. And what we're showing here is these were our measurements, and we have as a function of temperature, so how much limonene at different temperatures, and then the points are color-coded by the time of day. So one of the things that stood out to us right away is that we had these really high limonene values at like 5 in the morning. And remember I told you that mixing is important. So we first looked in to see, is this mixing? Because what happens at night, right, is that the air sinks, we say our mixing volume shrinks, but we showed that this was not in fact due to that. It wasn't the meteorology. And that we went through a series of steps that showed that this, in fact, is anthropogenic limonene. So it's coming from these cleaning products, et cetera. And so our next steps are we're trying to figure out what are the sources, the actual sources of these compounds. And we think this makes a big difference on the chemistry because you have this big burst of sort of this highly reactive limonene as the sun's coming up. So this was an exciting finding from our LA studies. Okay, I'm getting into my last few slides, a little bit of where we are now. So this figure, there's a lot of traces here, but basically what I want to point out here is this is a reference to the most recent standards. So again, going back to those national ambient air quality standards. And when we're above the line, red, that's bad. When we're below the line, green, that's better. And I specifically, again, we're still focusing on ozone and PM2.5. And these are changes in the average concentrations across the US from 1990 to 2022. So again, if you just focus here, we were seeing these strong decreases in some compounds, right? So we're starting in 1990, not the 60s and 70s like we did before. But what you'll see with ozone, right, is we had a decrease and then this flatlining since about 2010. The same with PM2.5. We had a steady decrease, and now in a lot of areas we're seeing sort of this flatlining. And on the national average, we're still below the standard, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of individual areas are above the standard. And so we're spending sort of a lot of time in the scientific circles trying to figure out what's happening here, why we're flatlining, what are the sources, and how we can continue to improve our air quality. Okay. Another way to look at sort of where we are and what's been happening in recent history. So this figure actually shows the number of days in different cities in which the standard was exceeded, and the color corresponds to those AQI index values, right? So those very deep purple are extremely unhealthy or very unhealthy. Red is unhealthy, and then unhealthy to sensitive populations. So the number shows the total number of days in exceedance. And so again, what we see over time is we definitely see this decrease in those very, very high levels, right? So this is good, but we just still see that we have a large number of days in exceedance. This is for Los Angeles. Different cities show different patterns. So this is Fort Worth, Dallas-Fort Worth. We see a very different picture in New York, New Jersey, right? Much stronger decrease in the overall number of exceedances. And this is Denver, right? So Denver actually has not quite seen the same overall downward trends as some places, and also didn't ever have these extremely hazardous days. So we use this kind of information to help us tease out what's happening, and again, how do we get to lower air pollutant concentrations across the country and really globally. Okay, I think I've got one more slide, I think, a couple actually. Okay, so you can imagine that when we're out doing these studies, we're making these measurements, we often get asked if the air we breathe is safe. And this is actually a very hard question to answer. And really, part of the problem, and it's almost easier to read this, but there's a lot of things that have not really been brought into the 21st century. So I mentioned to you before that we have not changed the criteria of pollutants or the hazardous air pollutants, right? We're still basing these air quality indices on pollutants that we knew were important, back then, but we're not calculating air quality indices for new compounds or different compounds. So this comes up a lot, for example, after a fire, right? Well, that your AQI index only tells you about PM2.5 ozone. It doesn't tell you about some of the other things that might be in the air. But in order to come up with some air quality index for those compounds, we need to be able to measure them, at high spatial resolution. We need to know how much is out there, and then we need to have some kind of standard as well. So there's really a lot that needs to be done. We have the ability to measure a large number of precursors and pollutants. We'd really benefit from some coordinated measurements and data archiving systems. So when I do a study in California, I can be more linked to someone else doing a study somewhere else, right? We start to share our data in these coordinated systems. And again, we need these ambient exposure levels and standards to actually update our AQI and help us answer this question of, is the air we breathe safe? Okay, so take-home points. that really these science, engineering, and regulatory partnerships have been extremely successful in reducing emissions, especially from on-road combustion sources, and that's led to lowering of ozone and PM levels in LA and other urban areas, right? Drastic reductions. We're kind of in the what's next phase. Ozone and PM levels are remaining near, at, or above the standards in many urban areas. Many sources contribute, right? These volatile chemical products, off-road mobile, cooking, et cetera. So we really need to think about, I think, what's next in terms of that science, engineering, regulatory partnership to help us get those levels down. And again, this AQI is a very convenient metric for communicating risk, but we need to start including new compounds and new exposures and standards need to be established. So with that, I want to say I do love my job. I hope that that was conveyed to you tonight, and I thank you for your attention. I'm going to just put up an acknowledgement slide. All my collaborators, contributors, my former research group at UC Riverside, UCAR, NCAR, my lab director, the Explorer Series team that helps get me ready for these events, and of course, Justin and the Longmont Museum for the invitation. So thank you. I think we have lots of time for questions. Yes.
Can we wait for a mic real
now
quick?
I can see
I'm
you.
going to get you a mic for the question where we're live streaming.
What are the things that are preventing scientists from adding chemicals to this AQI standard? Because we read now that there are thousands introduced every year, new chemicals. And is it possible to catch up with at least the most important new ones?
I think so. You know, I actually was interviewed and had this article come out recently in Chemical and Engineering News, and I said the first thing that I think we should do is just take a survey. We know things like fires and some other, that we have these pollutant sources that are very important. And we also now have a number of measurements from those sources. So I think it would be pretty easy to come up with a new list of, like, let's try to add 10 or 15 new compounds. And then I think the question is, so that's the first thing, right? Just decide the compounds that you want to go after. I think that's a pretty easy step and could be done. The second step then is understanding whether there are reasonable limits. Even if we don't have national ambient air quality standards for those, do we have some kind of reference concentration that does the same thing, which would say this level is protective of human health, right? So if we don't have those limits, then those need to be established, and it could be that for some of the compounds on our list, those things need to be established. So that could be one hurdle. And then probably, I think actually the biggest hurdle is that it's pretty easy to measure PM 2.5 and ozone. So we do have widespread measurement of those criteria pollutants. Adding widespread measurements of other pollutants, I think we have the technical capability, but we need data infrastructure, we probably need money, so I think that's probably the biggest hurdle. But those are the steps. Yes. Oh, I think she's got
Here,
the
I got a
mic,
mic
sorry.
for you.
When you had your charts up about the way that the blocks of pollutants were declining slowly over time, sort of, there was a striking anomaly on most of them at 2000 and 2020 and 2021. And that was 2020 was the year that we had COVID. So why were the pollutants going up during COVID?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back and see if this is the right slide. Was it this one?
No, the one that you just passed. No. That, and there are 5 others that were like that.
Oh, these, yeah. Okay. So, 2020, so 2020 is not, so again, every area is different. This is typically a combination of meteorology, right? So could be warmer temperatures, could be more stagnant air masses. So when we see this, if you're looking from one year to the other, a lot of times that variability is driven by temperature or meteorology, poor mixing. When we look at the trends over longer periods of time, we often have changing sources. So my guess, and I don't know what happened in every place, but that was due to meteorology.
I had a question about the limonene slide. You kind of mentioned this briefly, but do you speculate that a lot of the release in the morning is due to like plants releasing a lot of limonene
No.
early?
No, so we think, and that was kind of one of the interesting things, and sorry, it's a little bit hard now that I don't have my laptop to switch back and forth, but I'll try. Yeah, so that was actually the thing, is that if you were to take off those early morning markers, what you see is a really clear relationship with temperature, and that's what we expect from plants. So as they start to release more, typically, limonene and other emissions as it warms up, and with sunlight. So it's a light and temperature dependent emission. And so this, in fact, was not correlated and was much higher. And so we think that those are, in fact, the anthropogenic, the human emissions. And we don't really know the temporal pattern when they're released most, I think. But it does turn out that in the LA area, they are actually making a lot of these types of compounds for food and for personal care products, yeah.
Anyone else?
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, when I've tracked like my outdoor air quality, I think some of the worst times are when my neighbors are burning wood fires. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that. I feel like that's like something that's often overlooked because we think like, oh, fires are like natural, they're green, it's renewable. Can you speak a little bit maybe about your thoughts on like house fires in homes contributing to poor air quality?
Yeah, residential wood combustion is a very known contributor to poor air quality, both indoor and out. Actually, I forgot to mention this when I showed the meteorology slide. That was an inversion in Denver. So, I think back in the day, there were more residential wood combustion, right? People burning in homes, and then that cold air, again, there's limited mixing, kind of settles. And so there are a lot of places, especially in the western US, that actually violate that PM standard in the winter. And actually, now that you're bringing up, that's also something that could be a factor in, going back to your question, why do some years have higher? And I mentioned meteorology. It's not always warmer temperatures. It can also be colder temperatures. And in certain states, right, that can be increased residential wood combustion, less mixing, and higher PM levels. So in a lot of areas, I used to live and work in Oregon, and like they would do these change out programs, right, to help people convert to cleaner burning stoves, and that makes just a huge difference. Yeah.
Thanks.
So to test our knowledge, could you repeat your introductory thing to see if we actually know anything?
Yeah, my bio. We can.
Can I go? Yeah. Okay. How effective are indoor air filters at cleaning indoor air quality or improving indoor air quality?
Okay, so filters, so you might have heard especially during COVID, about like MERV filters. These you can build these boxes with filters and a fan. So we can filter really well for PM, for fine PM. And in fact, there's a lot on the internet of how to make your own. They're called the Corsi Rosenthal box. I really highly recommend it in this area. When we get high smoke concentrations, especially depending on where you live, and if you can't effectively filter that out of your home, we always recommend kind of creating, putting those in a few rooms and having some spaces. So we can very effectively filter particles. Gases are much trickier because particles filter out through physical filtration and like static charges, whereas the gases have to have affinity for whatever so you need like different types of adsorbents for different types of gases. And there are things like UV filters and other ways to destroy gases, but they end up being a bit dangerous. They actually end up making ozone. So, but there are some types of adsorbents that are good for some types of gases.
This is great, thanks. So I'm a third generation Angelino, so I have generations of my family have been sucking in LA air for a long time. I grew up in North Pasadena on the border of Altadena, and I still have a lot of family who live in that area. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the impacts of the fires. If you were living there while those fires were burning, or generally what the impact of those fires upon the LA population might be like long term.
Yeah. So there's, I guess, a several part answer to that question. So fires release a lot of PM 2.5, so the health effects are the same, but the levels are usually a lot higher. So usually for at least a few days, or while if there's not strong offshore winds, you are going to have very high levels, hazardous levels of PM 2.5. Now, when I'm showing, so from the perspective of the pollutants themselves and the health effects, those are the same. When I'm showing those annual averages though, right, and we look at sort of the number of days in exceedance, those are removed, right? Wildfires are allowed, we call them exceptional events. They don't count towards the number of exceedance days. So basically, you're raising the number of days that you're over the standard, right? And that's one of the ways. So there's both sort of this long-term, if you kind of step back, you've just increased the number of days that you're exposed above the standard. There's also acute effects from the very high levels. Okay, that's PM 2.5. As I've mentioned, this idea that the AQI probably needs updating. A lot of time, you can look at your air quality index, and this happened in LA where it was good. The air was good because the PM 2.5 was being blown offshore, but there was still a lot of toxic gases actually being released as during some of the cleanup and other processes. And unfortunately, there's again, because we don't have this sort of widespread measurement networks for those types of things, it's not obvious what the ambient levels. So, the precautionary thing is just, after a fire, it's so hard, right? You want to be inside, but then, certain homes are not safe either. There's a good paper by some local folks at CU that wrote about this and kind of compared different homes, after the Marshall fires too. We don't have great, this goes back to the technology part. I think we could continue to work on low-cost instruments to put in homes that, could tell us a little bit more other than PM. But, at least with the PM filters, make a safe room, You should be inside. Get out of town if you can.
Oh, I think we have time for one or two more questions.
We'll get back to you.
So I didn't hear you mention anything about refrigerants.
Yes. So, with the discovery of the ozone hole and the contribution of refrigerants to the destruction of the ozone hole, a lot of those refrigerants were phased out. And so we've seen pretty significant reduction in refrigerants. That said, and I will just say, like, right now I'm stepping like way into things that I know very little about, but we're all practiced in having opinions about things that we don't know. But no, I have some colleagues that still study refrigerants, and they actually say that definitely some, CFCs as they're called, are still out there, and that there probably are still sources, right, that they haven't been completely wiped out, and they're probably being produced and used illegally, and that is something to keep an eye on, because the ozone hole hadn't shown as much of a recovery as expected. So bottom line is apparently they're still out there, but it's better. There was a question in the back, middle. Do you still have a question?
I believe we're still trying to track some of the VOCs from the fracking out in Weld County that sometimes gets really pushed up against Boulder. I work in Boulder, and I've been pretty active against the fracking near schools and homes and water sources and whatnot. So I'm wondering if that is improving, if you have any idea if there's less fracking going on and our air quality is improving at all because of it.
I'm going to show you, I was going to try to get back here. I don't know if it's worth it, but basically, one of the early slides I showed, where I was showing these trends in LA over time, and there were several things that didn't follow those trends. So all this, that's all from natural gas. So natural gas markers are definitely up in many areas. They are a known contributor to ozone in the Front Range and elsewhere. Yes, that is a thing. I will also say, just to throw this out there, that recently I was talking to people that said, though, they felt like natural gas was the only way that we were initially going to get away from fossil fuel, coal combustion. So from a climate perspective, there's a global net benefit, and this is always where it gets complicated, right? But they certainly are known contributors to ozone.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our program. Let's thank Dr. Barsanti for an excellent. Am I still here? Okay, and the NSF NCAR Explorers Series staff for all of their hard work in putting these programs together. Thank you for all of you for coming out, and have a safe drive home.
And there is a survey. I don't know if it's faster.
The last slide.
It's the last slide, if it might be just on behalf of the NCAR Explorer Series, there is a quick survey. There we go. Great. Thanks so much.